World War II did not end the Great Depression. This is a claim that's commonly made. It's not only wrong, it's dangerously wrong because it can lead to the belief that going to war can be good for an economy. There is no profit in destruction, so it cannot be that World War II ended the Great Depression. So to convince you of this, let's first start by looking at the origin or the logic of the claim itself that World War II ended the Great Depression. So if we look at the NBER website, the National Bureau of Economic Research, is the institution in the US that officially dates business cycles. And the Great Depression is really two different recessions, one from the third quarter of 2009 to the first quarter of 1933, and a double dip recession in second quarter of 1937 to the second quarter of 1938. So looking at real gross domestic product. So a recession is technically defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of real GDP decline. So if we look at the year-over-year percentage change in real gross domestic product, we have an 8.5% decline from 1929 to 1930. The recession continues until FDR comes in, institutes the New Deal, another thing that didn't end the Great Depression, the subject of a different video. Then we have our double dip. Then Pearl Harbor occurs, of course, in December 1941. The U.S. enters the war, and we have close to 20% growth at the beginning of the war. Then a slight short recession as the war winds down, and then more or less with a few short recessions, uninterrupted growth up into the late 70s. So as you can see, right, we had a Great Depression, then we had a World War, and we didn't have a Great Depression anymore. Therefore, the war ended the Great Depression. So this logic is a common fallacy, but a fallacy nonetheless, called post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. So this logic isn't necessarily wrong, right? It could be that something that happened before something else caused the subsequent event, but it's not necessarily so. So we have a sequential understanding of causation. So something to cause something else must precede it. However, something preceding something else doesn't necessarily imply causation. So it's a weak claim to start off with. And as I'll argue further, in committing further fallacies, it's demonstrably wrong. I should mention before going on that in addition to the real GDP fluctuations, we have a similar story with unemployment. We don't have data going all the way back to, we don't have official data going all the way back to the Great Depression on unemployment, but most estimates put unemployment peaking at something like 25% in the depths of the first round of the Great Depression, and then falling to under 2% at the start of the war. So we lowered the unemployment measure, which is supposed to be a proxy for economic health, but we did so by sending people to war. So whether or not that measure is a good proxy for economic health in that case, I think is certainly debatable. Same with real GDP. GDP is a measure created by Kuznets in the 1920s, essentially in order to proxy for the productive capacity of an economy and the amount of goods and services that economy produces and is thus available for people to command in the pursuit of their standard of living, in the pursuit of their happiness. So we come up with this proxy, and those of you that remember intro, you remember that G is in GDP, government purchases. So as we have the expansion of the New Deal, G goes up, and so technically we get out of a recession because GDP is increasing. Same with the war. As government spending goes up to fight the war, we're not in a recession because GDP is going up. However, in that context, the measure of GDP is not really an appropriate proxy for standard of living in that context, I would argue. So whether the government spends money to destroy bridges or build bridges, that counts in government purchases in GDP. So it's not really reflecting what's going on. And the question is, did living standards go up? Would somebody that lived through both the Great Depression and World War II agree that World War II ended the Great Depression? And I would argue no, they would not, because living standards didn't increase. In fact, living standards were tough during the war. Basic foodstuffs were rationed. And you had severe penalties, up to 10 years in jail for trading on the black market, these ration stamps. So it was strictly enforced. There's no such thing as a 42 or 43 Ford or Chevrolet or a refrigerator from that era. Things you could order from the Sears catalog in the 1920s easily, you couldn't order during the war. So although GDP is increasing, especially at the beginning of the war, living standards aren't going up. Okay, so why is it that we can say definitively that the claim that World War II ended the Great Depression is wrong? Why can we say that it couldn't be true? Well, it's because the claim not only commits post hoc ergo propter hoc, it also commits another fallacy referred to as the broken window fallacy, which comes from Basquiat's famous essay, What is Seen and What is Not Seen. I've pulled up econlib.org. It's also available on a number of other sites for free. But the basic setup is a window is broken, and the claim is made that, well, it's not bad for the economy because this encourages the glassmaking business. This encourages the glazier. So suppose it'll cost 6 francs to repair the damaged window. It does give 6 francs worth of business to the glazier. That is what is seen. But if you claim that the broken window is good for industry in general, if you make the equivalent claim that World War II is good for industry in general, then Basquiat is obliged to cry out, that will never do. Your theory stops at what is seen. It does not take account of what is not seen. So since our citizen, James Goodfellow, the character whose window is broken, has spent 6 francs for one thing, he will not be able to spend them for another. If he hadn't had to spend 6 francs on the window, he could have had 6 francs to spend on shoes. So there's 2 points that come from this. One is James Goodfellow is worse off. Instead of having a window and shoes, he just has a window. The people during World War II are worse off for losing all of the property and productive capacity and people that were lost in World War II. It can't be that we're better off for destroying Europe and half of Asia and so on. Furthermore, right, you can't claim that the breakage and destruction encouraged industry in general, because if we didn't have to replace all of those broken windows, we could have continued enjoying the use of those windows and built other things. So we would have been unambiguously better off. We would have had a higher standard of living, which is really what we're talking about, if World War II had not have happened. Now, whether or not it was necessary and so on, those are different debates. But to claim that it was economically good is not true. Okay, so a couple of extra points before we go. Consider Japan. Japan suffered from the Great Depression as well, not to an extent as great as the U.S., but they had a depression in 1929, 1930 as well. And then, of course, were devastated. Their productive capacity was more or less destroyed by the war, and then proceeded under the Marshall Plan, more or less under a free market at the point of a gun. They proceeded to have the most spectacular economic growth probably in world history from the end of the war until about 1990. So would you say that World War II ended the Great Depression for Japan, that World War II was good for Japan? So it's obvious in that case, but the logic applies to the U.S. If the U.S. had the 500,000 soldiers and all of that equipment, and if they had made cars and trucks instead of tanks and planes, wouldn't the U.S. have been better off in the first place? Couldn't they have done all of what we've done after the war and more if we didn't have to spend those resources fighting the war? Okay, another last point is people make the claim that the war was particularly good for the U.S. because it destroyed the productive capacity of every other industrialized nation. And so we essentially dominated the world afterward. Now, this is a very temporary advantage. Also, I would question whether or not it's an advantage to not have other countries around the world able to produce goods and services that you want to trade for. But that aside, if we assume that it's good to be the monopolist producer of all of these durables, that advantage was obviously, as is clear now, very temporary. And also, perhaps we could have produced and made all of that profit and done all those things anyway without the war, right? Just in the competition of the market rather than the competition of death. So I hope that this video helps convince more people not to make the fallacious claim and fallacious conclusions from there based on the belief that World War II ended the Great Depression. It's not true, can't be true, and we should stop saying it. If you disagree, let me know. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to you soon.